Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. My name is Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and joining me again is one of my favorite guests, and I think the most common guest on the podcast. It is Julie Nurnberger-Haag. Julie, thanks for coming back.
Thank you for always having me back.
Yeah, we had lots of great conversations back in grad school, and we've just continued those conversations. And so I look forward to another one. We do have an article that we're going to be talking about, which is from the Electronic Journal for Research in Science and Mathematics Education, a journal I published in that I really appreciated my experience with that journal. But your article is called Tools, Tricks, and Topics Teachers Use for Integer Arithmetic. So we're going to be getting into integers. And that I know you did that work together with Scott Courtney. But before we get into that specific article, I do want to back up and just think about integers overall. We've had episodes about various things in elementary math. We've looked at books, we've looked at games and manipulatives that elementary kids kind of learn thinking about math. And I know in talking to you over the years, you've really had a consistent interest in integer learning specifically, and as the negative numbers are coming in and how those are handled. So where did that integer interest start with you, and why has that remained something that you're interested in that you think is important, like over a decade or more now?
Yeah, 2.5 decades. Or yeah, because it started when I was a student teacher. When you ask that question, I am picturing myself in that space and the textbook we were piloting and just thinking about how there had to be a better way to teach negative numbers and make this easier, and trying to figure out all the different ways we could teach negative numbers. And I'd also had my middle school methods course fresh in my mind. And at the time, what about negative numbers that hit me was the chips, which people who know me know my understanding and thinking about that has changed over the years. But I thought when I experienced it, I thought, if they would have used this with me, this would have been so much easier. But in hindsight, I realized that actually I was seeing it through an adult lens who knows math as opposed to a learner of math. And so it's been a passion of mine for those reasons. But in terms of why it's so important all these decades later, is I call it a gatekeeper concept that's camouflaged.
Mm.
So the importance of it seems to be minimized. Seventh grade teachers have such a challenge because it's essentially just folded into this entire standard about rational number and using negative fractions. But it affects every single thing they do in almost everything. I shouldn't use such hyperbole on a research site, but almost every math topic that comes after, it impacts how well a student's going to do. And there's so little time given to it. So we need to find ways to support teachers and students to do better.
Mhm. With the negatives. So it's not just like, hey, there's another kind of number. They're negatives. Okay, cool, we got it. Like, but deeply trying to explore that concept and all the implications therein of negatives.
And proficiency. Yeah.
Hmm. And I know we're going to talk about the article in the Electronic Journal for Science and Math Education, but first, just taking your like broad years of thinking about this, I wonder if thinking broadly, you have some recommendations that are already in mind for teachers or for curriculum leaders with regard to integer learning, like as a general approach or the way that you think about it.
Yeah, especially it's great that we can start with kind of that big picture. Sometimes with research we tend to follow the line of the research study and start with the nitty-gritty first.
Hmm.
And in the conclusion of our article, we brought up influences from our findings and other studies. And regardless of our philosophical beliefs about teaching, whether we're radical constructivists or believe in direct instruction, if you're going to use rules, making sure we avoid rules that expire using the construct from CARP. They included some negative number research on that, but this article helped bring out that that's really important. The games research you mentioned earlier, although different colleagues and I provided a theoretical framework for how to look at math games in the classroom, the context of those games happen to be negative numbers. And so making sure that those negative number or any games and games with negative numbers have chance and turn taking in order to avoid marginalizing any students. And then things that are really specific to negative numbers is using a vertical number line more often than horizontal. And especially that we would need to start that right away when we first introduce number lines in elementary school. And if we're going to use a chip model, then making sure, and we'll talk about it more later, but making sure we're using consistent meanings or consistent balance associations is what we're calling it, so that the colors actually connect with meanings that we already have in the world, as opposed to artificially ascribing a certain color to this abstract concept that students are trying to learn just because we can. Just because it is arbitrary in reality doesn't mean that that's how we should be teaching. So those are some of the recommendations. And then in terms of how we use chips or number lines, we definitely need more research on that. But my 2015 PME&A research report explained a particular way of using a number line compared to a chip model that was published originally in Mathematics Teaching in the Middle School in 2007. And based on this study, we know that at least from this sample, that way of using a number line still isn't being used.
Right.
So there's definitely some opportunities for how we can keep making negative numbers easier for students.
Yeah, and this is something I appreciate about the way that you think about these things is that you never take anything lightly. You always think like, okay, we have those chips, but how can we try to make it like the most mathematically coherent or the way that like it will promote students' insights in subtle and explicit ways. And same thing with the number line. It's like, okay, we might just be accustomed to having the number line going horizontal pretty often. But what if we go vertical? And what if the negative numbers are now this like plunging below sea level or like, below ground level? And that might just help in subtle or explicit ways for the students to just be making those connections and thinking about it. And so for me, I always appreciate that you shine a new light on these things. I'd be like, hey, are we being as thoughtful as we can to just set the stage so that students can make the most meaning or the sort of most robust meaning that they can?
Well, thank you, Sam. That's quite a compliment.
But yeah, let's go into it a little bit more. So this Electronic Journal of Research in Science and Math Education for this article in particular, what were some of the key ideas that you did gather from the literature as you were gearing up for this article and you're thinking about what the teachers are using when they teach integer arithmetic?
Well, one of the things we knew we wanted to ask was about context. So what contexts are students experiencing for negative numbers? And the Whitaker et al. Work, there's a whole, Project Z team, but a paper in particular with Whitaker as the first author mentioned how the contexts that are used for negative numbers are really artificial because people don't actually have to use negative numbers to think about those contexts. So it's really inauthentic to like require students to do that. And I mean, if we think about Jarofsky's work, right, like any contextual math problem that's given in school, at least in Jarofsky's theoretical perspectives, is also inauthentic, right? But negative numbers have a special place. It's one of those things that we definitely need to think about. Should we really be using context here? And what is the context that makes sense? And is it for learning, or is it just, do we want to make sure that after they learn, they can apply knowledge to these contexts? So I wanted to know what contexts do teachers value and what might be being used. And we also looked at the sequencing. So are certain contexts with certain ways of thinking used first or later? And then also, when you mentioned about thinking carefully about like the tools and the orientation of the number lines and things, that, it's all based on my theoretical perspective that I often draw on embodied cognition. And part of that is conceptual metaphor theory. And Chu, 25 years ago now, had found that learners do better if they use a conceptual metaphor while thinking about problems, even if adults don't always do that. And so thinking about learning integers versus actually using integers later, like that those might not be the same thing. And also why I wanted to do this study is I value so much what happens in actual classrooms and how do we make actual instruction useful and better and feasible for students and teachers. I still consider myself a teacher. I just happen to also, when I was a teacher, kind of thought like a researcher in the way I approach things, and then made sure I got a degree and did some more work to keep doing that. But I'm literally renewing my teaching certificate again this year in a couple of weeks. Most of the research on integer learning so far has mostly been from a radical constructivist approach and focused on how do people think? And what if we give them this prompt? Then what happens? Which has its value, but especially in this particular climate and especially the way the seventh grade standards are, teachers, even if they happen to have a radical constructivist belief, they don't have time to spend, or I'll frame it in terms of me. If I were still a classroom teacher now versus when I was a classroom teacher in middle school and high school, I had time to focus on integers before I ever had to introduce negative fractions. And there's very little time for them to do that now, and they're pressured to move on. And so we need more research that really teachers feel like they can immediately implement. So one of the really important things that a lot of the integer work that takes a radical constructivist perspective has offered us is those deeper insights and nuances about how people think naturally without a lot of intervention. And then we can use that to design other studies that teachers might feel like have more immediate applicability, or if they're offered professional development that includes that knowledge of what's been developed from a radical constructivist perspective, they can use that. They can think about those things while they're listening to student thinking, regardless of what exact approach they've chosen to use in their classroom.
Yeah, yeah. So let's go ahead and dive into the article itself. Could you cut right down to what you see the goal of the article? I know you're hearing from middle school teachers, but what was the main thing you were really wanting to get out of this article, this analysis?
We really wanted to know what is happening in classrooms now. Self-report, we know, is notoriously inaccurate. If we were to say, like, well, what's your philosophy of teaching, or what's your philosophy of how you teach negative numbers, or explain a typical day. And as we've talked about before and on the other podcasts I've done, I really care about the tools we use and how that influences what children have or students have the opportunity to learn and how teachers teach. But with integers, there are so many facets to integer instruction. There's often posters on the wall. We mentioned context earlier. We mentioned manipulatives. They might be using a number line. And there's just, where do teachers, especially in this day and age, get their resources that are influencing how they teach? So I couldn't narrow it down, which anyone who knows me knows is one of the things that I work on constantly to try to not overthrow the net, for example. But if we're going to understand how students are experiencing integer instruction in their classroom, then I thought we needed to see all of those different facets. And I wanted it from teachers. So asking them what tools they use or what book they use or where they get their resources was objective enough, I thought, for self-report that we could get an accurate picture, or at least a better picture.
Yeah, and I felt fairly convinced by that. You know, in a recent episode, I was talking to Alina Kadluba, and we were talking about self-reports, and she was sort of sharing the literature that it doesn't really work when you're trying to assess like teacher knowledge. It doesn't work to say, how knowledgeable do you feel? Like,
Yeah.
but this one I did feel was much stronger or more trustworthy, which is, hey, a number line when you're doing this, is it like this or is it like that? And the teacher can just tell you, like, that's how I do my number line. Or do you use these manipulatives or not? Like, I believe them when they say, yes, I use those manipulatives or not.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I felt like it was a fairly trustworthy kind of thing.
And one of the analyses, so about how do you use a number line, the way I got at that was actually through an open response, asking them to explain how they would use a number line to do it.
Hmm.
So that we did the analysis of, were they using language that implied it was on an a horizontal or vertical space so that it wasn't just a self-report in that way.
Right. But
Yeah.
you narrowed in on number lines where you're
Yes.
like, I'm specifically asking you about number lines, and then they're going to tell you some things. And I felt like, yes, I can pretty securely infer from this how they actually use the number line.
And another goal is, and the reason we did this study and wanted to know what teachers are doing is partly to justify prior and ongoing and future research. Like, where should we spend our time with our limited resources? What might make the most difference for teachers and students if we make sure we're doing it based on what are teachers saying they're already doing or not doing, and then we make decisions about that as opposed to kind of trying a one-off thing just based on what that we know negative numbers are hard, for example, you know.
Yeah, and so we've alluded to the survey. You sent the survey out to middle school teachers across Ohio, right? Like from various different parts.
Yeah, if not for my colleague, this study would not have occurred. Fortunately, he already had experience, and so we actually did the study in the way that he had done. So we were able to cite his prior study. We got the best response, that even better than he had had before. We just pulled email addresses that were publicly available from school websites. However, we were very systematic in we chose Ohio partly because we live here, but we also I have lived in different states, and even before the Common Core standards were guiding things, the standards in Ohio were really well done in terms of picking an area where everyone is teaching from the same standards and we're asking about resources, but the standards are pretty much the national standards, and textbooks, for example, are national. The internet is international, and we made sure to use the district information categories to make sure we were getting teachers from urban areas and rural areas and suburban areas. So we really tried to make sure that this possibly could represent the entire country as opposed to a convenient sample in our local area around our university.
Mhm. Well, let's at least dive for a sampling of your findings. I invite listeners to grab the article, which I believe is open access if people want to look at the details.
Yes, and anyone who knows me knows that is my mission, that if we're going to make a difference, we cannot have these things behind
Yeah,
paid walls.
right, right. Well, people can find more details there, but I just want you to touch on a couple of your ideas from the findings, maybe the big ideas, and I'm going to go through a few different sort of subcategories. So first of all, where did you find the teachers getting their integer materials?
So about three-quarters got some of their ideas from their textbook, but as we know, that's district chosen, right? So in terms of where teachers got their resources when they had the agency to choose their resources, as you might expect, the majority got them from online. And Teachers Pay Teachers was the most common place that they got their resources. And in terms of manipulatives, so when I say resources in that way, I mean like printables, games, ideas for how to approach teaching. But in terms of manipulatives, it seems they're mostly determined by what was available at their school. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Next, I want to go to the environmental math. So I know that's like a phrase from an earlier article of yours. I think your 2019, one of your 2019 articles. But maybe just talk about environmental math, how that fits into this particular study.
Yeah. So my master's degree is in learning disabilities and literacy. So I had the opportunity to expand my knowledge by learning about young children and environmental print as a theoretical construct in literacy. And I expanded that or specified that to be the things in our classrooms that are environmental math. So the environmental print that is mathematical in our classrooms. And so that article is also open source, so people can find it. And it says environmental math in the title, so you should be able to find it if you Google it. And so that's where we explained it and provided a framework for teachers to look at the environment in their classroom and what is mathematical that's posted. So what do their posters say? What might be on students' desks, especially in an elementary classroom, those kinds of things. And so for this article, it's relevant to our integer posters on the walls. If there's number lines posted, are they horizontal or are they vertical? Are they like the posters I'm gesturing all the way around the room, like we often see in elementary or middle school classrooms, or are they like more smaller on a poster? Those kinds of things.
So, did you get any insights from the teacher reports about what they put up with integers?
Yeah, so in the large scale as well as medium scale, and when I say medium scale, like a poster, and large scale is like the number lines we talk about going all the way around the room, significantly teachers had posted horizontal number lines, which makes sense because it's easier to find resources that are oriented that way. So again, a big finding we had that I didn't explicitly say yet is there seems to be, even for this topic in middle school, a very strong for-profit influence of the products that are available are influencing what we're doing in classrooms. So we need to attend to that because from embodied cognition perspective, a vertical number line makes more intuitive sense, even if a horizontal becomes more accustomed. Like even if a middle school student already thinks of a number line in a horizontal way, left and right are not intuitively negative or positive. Those are arbitrary based on the language we write and read in. But vertical is kind of a human experience from embodied cognition. Like we don't say price left, we say price drop, right? Children think someone who's taller is older because growing up means more. Like those kinds of things from embodied cognition and conceptual metaphor theory.
And I think the zero can become important in a more meaningful way. Like, of course, you can set zero on a horizontal number line
Yeah.
and you could try to put importance on zero.
Yeah.
But I alluded to it earlier. The zero on a vertical can be sea level or it can be ground level, or,
Right.
it just feels like you can imbue that with more of a zero-ness to it.
Yeah.
Or even like buildings, right? Like the first floor, second floor, third floor, like
Right.
going up, but you could also have the basement or you could also go down.
Yeah, it's just, and I've actually tried to get pictures, like, so as people travel or friends I have in other countries, I've been trying to collect pictures actually. So if people have them and want to send them to me,
Yeah,
my email is on the article, because some countries do have a zero floor
I
and a
love a
negative
zero
one.
floor.
I know, and a -2 floor, but instead of this lower level two stuff, where students, those people in other countries, if that's part of your life, then you inherently are going to have an easier time conceptualizing negative numbers.
I want to shift over to the tools and words that are used. And like we talked about before, often you think carefully about the tools and also the words and the phrases. So what did you find for tools and words that the teachers reported around integers?
So the tools, overwhelmingly, when they use chips, were the yellow red two color counters that I was actually surprised that they were so prevalent in integer instruction in middle school, because I know that to be a common elementary manipulative, and middle schools are often in a different building than elementary schools. But yet, that is one of the things that's produced that would make it available, and teachers tend to use what's available. And then there are also red and white two color counters. And I knew this from my own experiences with products. And so I had included that in the questions as well. And so those are what I determined are called inconsistent meaning valence associations. So the valence is arbitrarily assigned. Like, okay, you're supposed to remember that the red is negative and the yellow is positive. There's nothing inherently in our lives that says yellow should be positive to use that yellow red chip combo. We call that an inconsistent meaning valence association. Whereas other colors do have, people have ascribed positive or negative valence associations to other colors. Something I had forgotten to mention when you asked about research, well, it wasn't specific to negative numbers, so that's probably why I didn't bring it up. But drawing on research on color meanings, that killer meanings do matter. And so they should matter for learning as well. It matter in terms of cognition. And so, but cognition doesn't necessarily mean learning, right? It's just about thinking. And then we're trying to help students learn this really difficult abstract concept. So red and black, for example, red and black don't necessarily have inherent meanings. However, in financial contexts, on a spreadsheet, if we want to teach our students about business, black is used as a positive, like Black Friday, and red is used as a negative.
Yeah, and like you want to be in the black. That means your company's making money. Like, yeah.
Exactly. And then black and white, children are taught in like their opposite books of like go stop and go and left and right. And we think about yin and yang, and that those are necessary opposites that are synergistic together, right? Now, the stop and go idea, in my experience, I'd never seen or used green or red for positive negative balances. One textbook does, so a few teachers mentioned it. I do question that finding, like if inherently we can conceptualize that as when you sum the additive inverses, that it would be zero when you're trying to talk about stop and go. However, green and red are actually complementary colors on a color wheel as I dig into more about color meanings. So someone who has art as a resource for their thinking might conceptualize that more strongly as a consistent valence association meaning than someone else.
As long as they're not colorblind.
Correct.
I always worry about red green with color blindness, you know.
Yes. Yes. When teachers used any of those color combos that I refer to as consistent meaning valence associations, there wasn't a significant difference as to which one they used. But like I said, the red yellow combo was used and the red and the like if you combine the red yellow data and the white red data, all those inconsistent meaning were used significantly more than the consistent meaning. So I did mention that the red yellow combo seems to be because it's available. I mean, a couple teachers actually mentioned that, or like that they don't use chips because there aren't any there, or they stopped using them because their students couldn't remember which color was which.
Yeah.
But the red yellow is actually also in the Vandewaal elementary to middle school methods textbook that many of us as mathematics teacher educators use. So that textbook is already putting into people's minds, even if they're not telling teachers to use those colors, that may subliminally mean like, hey, these are what you should use for chips. And in Ohio, the model curriculum also shows those colors when they do the chip model. So even though they're not telling teachers they have to use those colors, those are some influences on why they might be using that.
And then also maybe a quick look at the terminology or some of the words used.
I mentioned that open-ended response about checking on how teachers are using a number line, for example. So we were looking for words like left, right, up, down, backwards, and things like that. And so that kind of language helps us think about which direction they're working and if there's a mismatch. So there's research, I believe it's Gentner, about even adults, if there's a mismatch of metaphors, it interferes with cognition. And we're not talking about learning when I say that. I'm saying just understanding what someone's saying. If teachers are on a horizontal number line, but they're saying go down, because we tend to say like it's a lower number or it's down 4, then there's a mismatch.
Or even just a higher number. Like
Yes.
it's not higher, it's more rightward.
Yes, exactly. So we want to think about all these things in order to give our students the best chance.
So, and again, there's more in the article. This is, you know, interesting stuff, and I think a lot of us can connect to integers or think about it. But I want to hit two more areas to just get your reactions here. So one is about the rules, like the rules for doing operations with negative numbers. So what did you hear from the teachers that, what might the teachers be doing and how might the students be experiencing some of those rules?
So we reported on whether teachers were using rules and also what rules are they using. And the whether they're using rules, I actually predicted that because the rules for multiplying and dividing are so much more regular, that they might use rules for multiplying and dividing more often than adding and subtracting. But actually, there was no significant difference between those. Overall, a majority of teachers were using rules, like meaning explicitly teaching rules for integer operations. And some listeners who are really embedded in math education research might wonder or be concerned about that. And in terms of, I just love teachers and I consider myself a teacher. And so making sure we think about, like I said earlier, the time pressure, especially for seventh grade teachers, especially the standards that are about multiplying, dividing, and adding, subtracting negative numbers, do not provide space for teachers and students to learn just how to do those things with integers. They're supposed to be jumping fast into fractions. So I have empathy, even if a teacher doesn't want to just teach rules. And this study doesn't say they just teach rules, it's just whether they do. So they might offer a really investigative, hands-on experience, but then also make sure they have the rules. But what rules get taught, that surprised us a little bit. And so we documented 14 rules that were used.
Yeah, I can call out a couple of these just because some of them are fun, but like
Okay.
two negatives make a positive. That one kind of expires a little bit. There's keep change change. There's two minuses make a plus. But then there's some that are a little bit more valid where it's like minus a negative becomes plus a positive. So that's kind of putting the number together with the operation. But yeah, those sorts of things where they try to boil down an idea into this like mnemonic or this like mantra that you can kind of repeat.
Yeah, and so what the way you just said it is exactly how we analyzed it. We used the rules that expire construct to separate out, okay, yeah, these rules are valid rules as stated. And then these other rules, teachers have the best intentions, but it's only valid when they were teaching multiplying, dividing, for example. But then students remember it and misapply it to any aspect.
Yeah, like keep change change.
Yeah,
You got to remember, like, under what specific conditions do you do keep change change? It's very
exactly.
easily you could overgeneralize that. Yeah.
Exactly. I consistently see students that weren't my students because I don't use keep change every sign, no matter what the sign was. So if the operation was addition, they still changed all the signs after it because that stated rule of keep change is too much of a shortcut and doesn't specify under what conditions it applies.
But so the teachers use that a lot, and there was more of them were using rules that expire, right? And then it was
Yes.
less common to use the sort of like valid, more generalizable rules.
Yeah, only three teachers wrote in rules that were valid with enough context that it was valid as stated. Yeah.
All right, well, I do want to hear from you on one more thing, which is something of interest to maybe a lot of people, which is abstract mathematics or like naked number problem kind of things versus contextual mathematics or things that have a maybe a situation around it or a word problem kind of thing. So, what did you find in that regard?
Yeah, let me preface this first so that people know where I'm coming from when I say something that math education researchers might not initially think they agree with. I believe in contexts, and one of the problems, because as I mentioned, I was also a special educator, or maybe I didn't mention it in this podcast, but I have in others. My master's degree is in learning disabilities and literacy, and one of the things that is done in special education is to remove context and try to strip it down to a bare number problem, thinking that'll make things easier. In general, we're not talking about integers specifically. And in a lot of instances, it makes it harder as long as we use a context that makes sense to students and we're using appropriate vocabulary that isn't above their reading level and things like that. So I believe in context tremendously and advocate for this. However, when it comes to negative numbers, as some research has mentioned, it's inauthentic in a lot of instances to try to force students to use a negative number in a particular context, even if in general it could be thought of using negative numbers. Humans want to solve problems efficiently. So I wanted to know, what context do teachers think are important? And then what ones do they use and in what order? And over 60% said money, credit, debits, and debt is extremely important. And another 29% said somewhat important. So almost 100% said that that set of context is important. And again, a very almost 100% said thermometer is important. A majority said elevation. Interestingly, a combined extremely somewhat only about 25% said chemical charges are important. And so one of the things we talk about in the discussion is future, and I think this will is future research. Is it important to use chemical charges as a way to learn negative numbers, but when chemical charges are more or an abstraction that we can't see, is that something in science that students need proficiency with negative numbers and then learn about chemical charges? So that's one of the things that research should investigate so that we can we can help guide both math and science instruction.
Hmm. Yeah, the two that always come to my mind are like with American football and like
Yeah.
losing yards, and maybe that could be like, and they do say that's a negative play, or like, oh, they've had two negative plays in a row of like moving backwards. But I wouldn't push that one too hard, or I would want to like see more about it. But you mentioned briefly thermometers. I always get nervous with thermometers because we talked about the zero and the zero-ness of zero, like the actual additive identity. And I always get nervous about thermometers because that the zero that's marked in Fahrenheit or Celsius is not a mathematical zero. Well, because you can't really add temperatures in the same way that we would like add integers. Like if I have a 20-degree thing and a 30-degree thing, if I add them, it's not 50 degrees now. But also for some of the same reasons, the zero doesn't have the same zero-ness, and so I could get it where it's like, yep, it's the thermometer and we have negative temperatures, but to me, that's a real world situation that does not map one to one onto the, mathematical integer.
So I would tweak what you're saying in terms of the zero in a thermometer not being a location per se, but it's analogous to a location on a number line versus an operation with it.
Yeah, right.
And
It
yes,
really breaks apart completely if you try to operate on the
yes,
numbers. Like if I have a liquid that's 0 degrees,
yes.
and I have a liquid that's 10 degrees, I add them together. Guess what? It's not gonna like the zero is not an additive identity to leave it as 10 degrees. So maybe it's when that it starts to operate. That's maybe what really makes me nervous. But even I also like zero to be like the complete absence of the thing. And something that's at a temperature of zero still has like energy. It's
Yes,
not void of all energy
right.
or empty of all temperature. Like it has a temperature. It's just one that we've marked as zero. So I don't know if this is just a personal hang up of mine, but
Well, I love this conversation in terms of making sure that, again, we're thinking about integers in science and in math and what's valid and so that we're not confusing students and that we
mhm.
have it straight in our own understanding, especially since some of the math teachers have science knowledge and some don't or like extensive science knowledge. But you're wanting zero to be the absence of something is for other study discussions, right? Because the absence of something is from conceptual metaphor theory of thinking of
Object collection kind of thing.
object collection metaphor, whereas a movement metaphor does allow for zero because it's a position. Like I know you would agree, the zero origin on a coordinate axis is mathematical, but it's a location.
Hmm.
Yeah. But see, intuitively, because from birth, we were taught zero is nothing, as opposed to also being exposed to the movement metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to give it credit, I should say there's one nice way that it would work out, which is if you had something that was 10 degrees and then the same amount that was negative 10 degrees, and you put those together, it actually would become zero. So that's one case in which it would work out, but that's almost just by accident, I think. Like everything else, it's not going to work on the operations with the temperatures.
Mhm.
But anyway, yeah, this
Yeah, so these are going to be awesome studies that need to be done.
Yeah, yeah. But well, overall, thanks for your work on this. It is really interesting to just think about integer learning and think about the environment and the situations that middle schoolers are having for integer learning. I appreciate you gathering and looking systematically through all this teacher input. My last question, I am just curious though, beyond what we were just talking about, but just for yourself in this analysis, is there still an unanswered question, or is there still something that's really like on your mind even after having done this analysis?
Well, especially since the intention of this study was to be able to justify future studies and understand better what's happening in real classrooms. Absolutely. So, of the consistent meaning balance associations, how do each of those influence learning? And if students are offered choices, which ones do they pick? Or, how many different ones is it useful to use? So in that 2015 study I mentioned before that I did when I did the chip model, we started with black and white as opposites, thinking that would tap into their childhood experiences, but then taught them the financial context of black and red, which, by the way, is the colors used in the Connected Mathematics Project books. And then I let the students continue to choose. Your group choose whether you want to use black and white or red and black. And then how much experience with vertical number lines instead of overlearning horizontal is needed at various grades. So if they're already in fifth grade, how much vertical exposure do they need to counteract the overlearning of the horizontal? Or what happens if we start with vertical? So those are very specific negative number things that I would be passionate about, but I also want to put a call out to grad students and early career faculty who might be looking for a project idea. One of our findings was interesting, so about teacher resources in general. So we recommended that a study be done that collects data with the same survey for all teachers of math across K to 12 about where they get their resources so that judgments can be made about based on grade bands. Because Shapiro et al. Found the same kind of sequence or ordering of which resources were used most and next most and next most, including, when we talk about teacher journals and things like that. But our middle school theirs was an elementary study and ours was a middle school study. And our study was post-pandemic and theirs was pre. And the percents were off by quite a bit. And we think it's probably because they're middle school teachers as opposed to elementary. But we can't make those claims because that's not what the study did. And I think it would be really valuable and important to know which teachers are getting resources where. If a grad student, early career faculty member is looking for a teacher resource, teacher ed focused study, that would be really useful for the field.
All right, great. Well, Julie, thanks again. This is your sixth episode, I believe. You're still holding the lead position for most
Okay.
frequent guest.
Okay.
But
Well, we had another article come out, and I'm just waiting for the teacher article to try to do one
oh
next.
yeah, that'd be great. Well, no, it's always fun talking to you, and like we said before, I just really appreciate how you're so thoughtful about the learning environment and the resources. And we've talked about, books, games, manipulatives. Now we're kind of seeing about how all of that comes together, the terminology, the posters on the wall. How does this set up students to learn some really like important, deep, like conceptual mathematics, curriculum sequencing? I think we talked about in one
Oh
of the
yeah.
articles. Yeah.
Oh,
So,
and in here with we didn't talk about that. The sequencing of which models are used first.
oh yeah. So it's not just
Yeah.
picking one or the other. It's kind of like could they grow or build on each other? Yeah.
Well, not could, but which models did they use and in what
Uh,
order? So when people can look at this article and find that information there too.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I always appreciate it. Thanks for your work.
Thank you so much, Sam.